And welcome once again to Writers on Writing on 88.9 FM, KUCI. We're broadcasting from the campus of the University of California, Irvine. I'm Barbara DeMarco-Barrett. Writers on Writing features authors, poets, literary agents, and editors discussing the art and the business of writing. Before we go on and I tell you who my guest is, I want to say that the opinions you hear here today are those of my guest and my own. And no one else's, not the University of California Regents, no one but ours. My guest today is Kate Braverman. Kate Braverman is a native of Los Angeles. She was an activist in the 60s in Berkeley, a member of the Venice Poetry Workshop, and professor of creative writing at California State University. She also taught creative writing at the UCLA Writers Program. Kate Braverman has published 3 novels, Lithium for Medea, Palm Latitudes, and Wonders of the West, 4 books of poetry, and 2 collections of short stories. Her stories, Tales from the Mekong Delta and Pagan Night, are widely anthologized, and her work has been selected for Best American Short Stories. In 1992, she received the O. Henry Award. A new trade paperback edition of Lithium for Medea with a foreword by Rick Moody was published in April by 7 Stories Press. Her new book, The Incantation of Frida K., was also published by 7 Stories, and she has moved from New York to the Bay Area. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Barbara.
Great to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here.
This book is incredible. How did it come about?
Well, I think I was looking for a vehicle that could work with my general sensibility, the interest I have in women who defy the ordinary standard demarcations, women who resist the obvious, women who reinvent themselves by desert moonlight and morphine, revolutionary women. And so Frida Kahlo just seems like a perfect person for me to inhabit. People still don't really know who Frida Kahlo is. Did you know that, Barbara?
Before I came on, I told someone the title and she didn't know.
Yes, I was at dinner in San Francisco last week with a psychiatrist, 2 lawyers, an architect, and a journalist, and none of them had ever heard of Frida Kahlo.
What do you think about that?
I think that there's a resistance in the culture sometimes to Spanish. Just Spanish names somehow seem to fall into a void. I remember in Palm Latitudes I had my character was named Marta Ortega, which is a very simple name when you consider, the complexity of an average Russian name with the 3 unpronounceable 12-syllable words. And people don't seem to have a problem with that, but I think there's a problem with Spanish. I think the name looks alien and forbidding.
But she is quite known. If you were to describe to anyone who she was, that she was married to Diego Rivera and that she was a well-known artist, it starts clicking in.
I think there's always a big difference between what people in the literary world and art world know as opposed to what people in other professions know.
Yes.
But be that as it may, Frida Kahlo is a fascinating person, and the idea that she was married to Diego Rivera, the most famous painter of the period, is very secondary and peripheral to her fascination. She was bisexual. She was a morphine addict. She was a communist. She was the first woman psychoanalyzed in Mexico. She was half Jewish. She seems a compendium of what it is to be a modern human being. Plus, she had enormous physical suffering. And her painting is so radical compared to Diego. And in the book, Diego Rivera, in case people don't know, was famed as a muralist. He did the Pacific Stock Exchange building in San Francisco, and he did the Rockefeller building in New York with his murals. And in my book, Frida says, he says to her, your paintings, they're garish and miniature and self-exploitative. And she says, perhaps, but you, Diego, paint walls.
Now, it brings me to actually my next question, and that is, this is a novel, it's fiction, and yet in reading this, I'm wondering, how did this happen? Did this happen like this? Did they ever have a conversation like this? What might have happened here? Now, before you wrote the book, what did you do in terms of researching her life or really getting the material?
I read a couple of biographies,
Mm-hmm.
and I spent a lot of time looking at books of her paintings, and most of all, photographs taken of her. And what I like to do as an exercise, and I have my students do this, is to look at a photograph and tell me everything that isn't there. What is the character thinking? What time of day it is? What do they smell? What did they dream last night? What is the music in the room? All the intangible aspects that I think it's a writer's business to put on the page. I'm really not very interested in narrative. So you might say I began to inhabit Frida in a visceral and psychological manner. And her story was so fantastic, with the trolley car crash that put a 12-foot metal pole, impaled her, actually entering her through the vagina and exiting through her spine, that when you start with material like that, the story is, it's almost too much for fiction. So what I found I began to do during rewrites was change many of the true things because they didn't seem true. You know, writing is not about what you want to write. It's a dynamic. It's a dance. You do some, and the page does some. And the page required that I do a lot of invention and remove a lot of the real material.
Interesting. Is that along the lines of, if I wrote about it, no one would believe it, and fiction is more believable than truth?
A little bit.
Interesting. If you just tuned in, you're listening to Writers on Writing. My guest is Kate Braverman, author of The Incantation of Frida K. You spoke just a minute ago about an exercise that you give your students, and it brings me to teaching, and that is that quite a few people I know, and authors actually who've been on my show, like Janet Fitch and Mary Rayco, credit you for helping them become serious writers. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about your approach to teaching, because it sounds quite different than most.
Well, I'm a very good cold editor. I don't have to look at the material a long time. I can tell instantly what I think is wrong with it and right with it. And I'm brutally honest, and I can never dissimulate my opinion about the work, and my opinion is constant. So I've been able to help many writers. I had terrific private writing classes that I taught. Also, Joyce Weatherford, who lives in the Irvine area,
Yes,
has a wonderful book, came out last year. And, quite a few writers. In fact, at one point I went through an anthology and noticed that I had worked with just about every Los Angeles woman writer that was in the anthology.
interesting.
And I think that they were able to trust me in a sense that I was completely coherent in my point of view, like a thermometer. I could tell them if they had a fever and if they didn't. And there was a great climate of creativity that I was able to, engender and, keep fueled. And so, yes, I had a lot of success with the writing. I believe a lot in exercises, that there's no particular story that's a great story. It isn't better on Fifth Avenue than it is on Fifth Street in Santa Monica.
Mm-hmm.
It's some people would come with dramatic material like the war in Salvador or something and think that made it better material. Also, that's always been a problem with the women's movement and other movements, that if you have a great cause, that means that the work that comes out of it has a kind of grandeur and importance that it might not have otherwise, and that's just not true. The work is what you make it. And I would have students, I was going to do this today, put together, say, a still life, a completely accidental still life, 2 peaches, 3 bananas, a bottle of water, and write 20 pages. And how do you make that interesting after you've said there are 2 peaches and a plate and 3 bananas and a glass of water?
Mm-hmm.
And what you need to do in order to bring that to a 20-page fruition is say, what does that color yellow remind the character of? I remember touring the banana plantations in Mexico with my daughter right before she ran away. We began in Mexico City, whatever, and you start to find yourself forced to make the moment more than it is by using sensory detail. And the peaches, they were somehow spoiled like California afternoons where there's too much sullen pastel leaking into everything, spoiling the air, your memories, the taste. You start to riff on it.
Your work is loaded with sensory detail. Is that how you get to it, or is that a natural way for you to think?
I don't think it was particularly a natural way to think. No writer does it all. And as you go along, you're able to, if you're going to continue and become a professional, identify the things you can do and the things you can't do. And I was really a poet who could write dialogue. And narrative, conventional narrative, has always been a weak point for me. So I've had to deal with my strengths, and my strengths are language and sensory detail. So those are things that I've worked on, that I've developed the capacity to sustain, the stamina, and so what I usually tell my writers is find out what you can do it until you drop. You'll probably have to learn a few other things and stay away from what you can't do. For instance, Philip Roth, who's I think getting much better as a writer, really could not give you a landscape. If you put a 9mm at his head and said, tell me what the orchard or what the maple trees look like at the beginning of October, how their leaves look like burned martyrs screaming through their bleached mouths. You see, I just riff. Mm-hmm. And Roth couldn't do that. What he does is dialogue. And he's able to basically sustain beautiful fictions through his dialogue. Another example would be Garcia Marquez, another writer I love. If you said to him, give me a viable picture of a woman, give me a viable moment between a man and a woman, you'd have to, fire the 9mm. He couldn't do it. What he does is language and fantastic illuminations of the moment, and but dialogue is not something he does. Would you like to go out and find the green ice of the moon? Yes, and let's take the unicorn and the gypsies with the dancing coins. As a example. That's not, of course, a real example. That's a metaphorical example of Marquez dialogue.
But you're saying that instead of dwelling on the aspects of writing that are perhaps more difficult for you or don't come naturally or that you're not as strong in, to focus on the things you do well and to just do it.
Yes, and it's very perverse. When I first start working with new writers, they almost always want to do what they're bad at, and they continue being bad at this, feeling that it's like it's like a triathlon. You have to do all the aspects, and I have found that that's not true. Of course, if you're a natural storyteller, that helps. I'm not, so there are ways that you can work. For instance, I'm just an experimental fiction writer, And I have a very good sense of my women. I have a very good sense of myself. And I have a great aesthetic and political and psychological desire to be an unrepentant guerrilla stylist. I want to slide between the palms and the hibiscus, between poetry and fiction, with an ear for dialogue and a sickening yearning for discovery and revelation.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to Writers on Writing, and my guest is Kate Braverman, author of The Incantation of Frida K., published by Seven Stories Press. Will you read to us?
Yes, and this is a section of the book where Frida Kahlo, who has an imaginary daughter, and it is a time when she's fought being amputated and in a wheelchair all her life from the grotesque accident. And this is a time towards the end of her life when she goes to search, by the way, for her perhaps imaginary daughter. My shoes were fouled from within. I thought of ports in which the cholera dead have been thrown, and corpses float brilliant as stars, bloated and rancid, each a lighthouse where a rat would live. When I was well, when I could move my fingers and arms, I painted. They were not self-portraits, but scientific experiments. They were blueprints and directions. I was using pigments to vanish. Memory is a construct, a series of sketches in constant fluctuation. I did not look into the mirror, but through it. I painted myself as an infant, nursing from a gold breast under a sky with stars like tears. I painted cactus like severed hands bleeding. My fruits were carnivores. I painted multiple Fridas. There is theme and variation. We live our incarnations simultaneously. When Diego was gone, I would search for Flora. The driver took me in my wheelchair. I knew each plaza, each cathedral, the ruts, the patches of mud, and the alleys winding into a rubble of stark adobe and stone. A street of carved wood slats, holes where there once were windows, crushed grates, soiled air, stale candies and piñatas hanging by wires. A family passes in an ox cart with enormous wheels, sacks of oranges on the bottom, paper flowers. The ox is white and adorned with bells around the neck, little bells from Oaxaca. The alley jogs into darkness and shadow. The cobblestones are broken. I must be careful with my wheelchair. Children squat in patches like pigeons. Women balance clay water jugs on their heads, baskets of dirty clothing, grains, and hot peppers. Young women naked above the waist, washing themselves with soap flakes in a smear of sun, laughing. A boy with a goat, piles of burlap sacks, men unconscious, drunk on battered cobblestones. Further, a man in a torn shirt leans against bags of laundry. He smokes a cigar, spits, sits with his filthy feet showing. He watches me with hard eyes. He sells secrets and contrabands. He looks like he just stuck 2 fingers into his daughter, made a circle inside with fat knuckles bent, and said, "Get used to it." His family has fed themselves by peddling their children and their lies for 3 generations. It's easier than farming. Wheelchair on uneven stones, push and slide, push and slide. I am the size of the children, the men sitting, the women squatting, offering warm meats, chickens, dogs, a cathedral where stained glass windows turn the sanctuary into a brassy grotto. Pregnant women sleep there when it's hot.
Thank you. That was Kate Braverman reading from the Incantation of Frida K., published this year by Seven Stories Press. How aware are you when you're writing of the marketplace?
How aware am I?
Yeah, because your writing is so
uninhibited. It's an act of insurrection against the marketplace.
Yes.
And the difference between a writer and an artist is that an artist does not consider the marketplace, whereas the marketplace is the primary consideration of a writer. And that I think is one of the major differences between being an artist and being a writer.
Then where is the line or the balance between actually, if you're a writer who hopes to support themselves doing this, writing...
Doing art?
Yeah.
Well, if you want to do art, it's necessary to get another job, a real job that will pay you money. So the idea that you can do art in writing at this time in the global technological image-ridden revolution is not a viable idea. It's like saying I'm going to go into canoe building or telling the tales of the ancient Samoan warriors in their dialect, and I'll just wander from boulevard to boulevard singing my song. It is not a viable idea, like carving carriage wheels for horse carts. It is not going to make a living. And I think the best thing to do is to get a high-paying job with flexible hours so that when you're on a run with your work, you can stay with it for long periods of unbroken time.
And likewise, then, because publishing is such an end result for most writers feel that they haven't succeeded unless they publish.
That's true.
Then, again, there's a discrepancy sometimes between creating good work and actually getting it out there.
Well, there are many journals and small press venues for real art. I don't think that that's a problem in terms of the vast number of poorly paying or barely paying literary, college literary magazines and lesser-known literary magazines. Of course, there are more people who want to write than there are magazines that publish writing. Writing is the number one hobby in America. And because you don't have to learn how to mix paints and you don't have to buy any materials, and everyone thinks they can write because you learn the alphabet and how to spell, whereas everyone doesn't think they're a musician because everyone doesn't know the scales and how to play an instrument. But everyone thinks they can write, and it's a delusion that is, it's in the fabric of the society. It has a romantic aura, and it seems possible. And, of course, this is encouraged by the publishing industry's mania for first novels, because everyone would like to pick up a cheap novel and have it be, White Oleander by Janet Fitch and have it selected by Oprah Winfrey. But the truth is, and painful though it is, I even held this idea. I thought that I could be a visual artist when I went into exile 8 years ago from Los Angeles and moved to the middle of nowhere. Truly, our closest airports were Pittsburgh or Toronto, in a town without a restaurant or a movie theater. And they had a good art school there. And I did take 2 years of printmaking, and beginning students were throwing away works of art that were much better than anything I would ever make. And I also held that conception that if I really focused and put the time in and learned how to use the materials, that I could make prints that I would want to frame and put on the wall and sell. Yes, I would have an art show and sell them. And it was a notion that I had to abandon. And people do think that they can write. If they could just take 6 months off, they could have their novel. And of course, this is fed also by creative writing teachers whose only way of earning a living is to tell creative writing students that they have talent and can get published and have a career. And that's obviously absurd.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and please stay with us, Kate, and everyone out there, stay with us, too. We'll be back in just a minute with more Kate Braverman. Do not go away.
Come back, baby, please don't go. No, I love you, darling, hate to see you go. Come back, baby, let's talk it over one more time. My heart's full of sorrow, mama aching tears. Gone 24 hours, child, seem like 1,000 years. Come back, baby, let's talk it over one more time. You know, little darling, Rome was built in a day. Let's talk it over before you go away. Come back, baby, let's talk it over one more time.
And welcome back to Writers on Writing on 88.9 FM in Irvine, California. This is KUCI, and we're broadcasting from the University of California, Irvine. I'm Barbara DeMarco-Barrett, and my guest today is Kate Braverman, author of The Incantation of Frida K., published by Seven Stories Press. What do you think of MFA programs, Kate? They're so incredibly popular right now.
Well, I'm of several minds about MFA programs, and I wanted to tell you how much I like the music that you're playing on your program.
Oh,
was that Dinah Washington at the top?
Yes, it was.
Because in Palm Latitudes, my characters listen to Dinah Washington incessantly, and a good exercise would be to write 20 pages on what the voice sounds like.
Interesting.
And also that blues you were playing just now, I like.
That's my husband.
That's your husband?
That's my husband.
Who is that?
Brian Barrett.
Is he like a famous blues singer?
He's not famous, but he plays most nights around Orange County and Southern California area.
I thought he was wonderful, and I was going to say as an exercise to describe that voice and what does that guitar sound like? And you can do that with music that you're familiar with and music you're unfamiliar with, and just pretend, this is an exercise I do, pretend that you were describing this music to somebody who is deaf, so that you would have to tell them that the music sounded like, and you would have to use sensory information. You'd have to talk about it in terms of color. You'd have to talk about it in terms of heat, in terms of visions. And in the same way, you can pretend that someone is blind and you are describing a painting to them or something. And so MFA programs, I was the first person ever accepted into the UC Irvine writing program in 1977 in both fiction and poetry. And rather than recognizing that as a real opportunity and recognizing then that the powers that would be at Irvine would make me a star and use their academic and media connections to make me famous, I did completely fail to understand that. I was so busy being an artist that I think probably I did not even recognize that there was a political structure to publishing until maybe 10 years ago. I was just, out of my mind, burning the candle at both ends. Art, art, art. And surely anyone will recognize and believe this, and that they will be, taken by how I've created a new feminized electric female language, that does not apologize for itself ever, that I was investigating naked consciousness, female naked consciousness, and that this work would be, immediately recognized, received, and taken, profoundly, seriously. And so MFA programs, in most part, I was doing a residency at a program recently, a well-known program, and they said that I asked them, what % of your writers are going to go on? And they said about 10%. And I said, 10% of your MFA students are going to be, let's say, make $60,000 a year, which I think is, a supporting wage that you can live in a bohemian lifestyle and pay for child care and a couple of potatoes on that. And they said, oh, no, we don't have anyone in our program now that we think could do anything like that, but we think that 10% of them will get jobs teaching in academia in creative writing programs. So they're largely factories for producing more creative writing teachers, which is a terrible thing to do if you're a serious writer. You put your vital energy into teaching, and I think that I would really, unless you a student were to receive a fellowship like the Stegner Award at Stanford, something that would demonstrate great interest in them in a tangible, way, like giving them money. I think that a writer can gather what they really need by being a very serious reader, read all the reviews, read everything that's out there, read Best American Short Story cover to cover every year, read The New Yorker, develop a sensibility. And there are enough people out there in alternative settings that can supply you with what you need as you go along. For instance, I taught in the LA area for 20 years. I know that people like Dina Metzger teach. I know people like Holly Prado teach. I know that a large number of fine people teach privately. And there are places like Irvine and UCLA offer special weekends with very talented writers. So I'm not a big believer in MFA programs.
The short story, how do you feel about it these days? I mean, writers writing the short story feel, on the one hand, a little bit hopeless and at the same time jazzed by the form. Hopeless because of publishing.
Pardon me?
Hopeless because of the difficulty in publishing.
It seems to me that the New Yorker, who doesn't publish me, and may the people who are responsible for that get a slow stomach cancer. But I think that the New Yorker's publishing lots of new writers whose work I've never seen before, never heard of. Yeah, it's very clubby to make big money writing short stories, but I think that the short story is a uniquely modern form. I probably have had, as much success writing short stories as I have anything else. I think the short story is a marvelous form. It's like a novel is a marriage, and a poem is a one-night stand, and a short story is a love affair. It's beautiful modern form that you can do anything with. However, they are very hard to publish, and I believe that if you can write a short story, you can write a novel by putting in the sensory detail. And I've put together novels by randomly taking short stories that were written in the same voice and then finding often arbitrary narrative grid to put on top of them. So I think that you can use short stories as fodder for bigger works, but I think that I agree with the difficulty. And if you think about it, the last book of short stories that really resonated in this culture was Salinger's 9 short stories, which is 50 years old.
Yes.
So in terms of having a career as a short story writer, Raymond Carver did it, but it took him all his life, and Tobias Wolff is doing it now. But I do agree with its inherent, commercial problems, and I would encourage people to then write short stories, write them, find which ones are in the same voice, and see if you can't take the next step into making a novel out of them.
You're listening to Writers on Writing. I'm talking with Kate Braverman, author of The Incantation of Frida K. There's an interesting story about you regarding the short story, and I'm not sure which story of yours it is. It might be Tales from the Mekong Delta. It's a story you wrote that was rejected, and apparently you convinced the editor to take it on, and they did, and it was a prize-winning story. Is there any truth to
this? Yes, there's a lot of truth to that. And also I've been on the eligible list for Best American Short Story 12 or 13 times. And I've had to find myself in a position with some of these stories where I truly had to beg the editor, and it's been knowing that if I could just get it into print, I could win Best American Short Story with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be just a problem of getting it into print. And one finds over the years that one's energy to get down on one's hands and knees to an undergraduate student at a college literary magazine and beg them for the life of your story. And yes, that happened to me with several of my stories that went on to win prizes, that I could not get them published in any journal of any stature.
So what made you do that? What made you know that that's what you had to do, that you had to convince somebody because it was a good story and they didn't see it?
Yes, no one saw it. Not at the New Yorker, not at Harper's, not at Granta, not at anything that you can see. And in one, I had Story Magazine take one, and the other one was in Zizova. I mean, these are the stories that are anthologized in the Norton Anthology of short fiction, the college textbooks. And it's really amazing. I am in most of them, and I look at the table of contents, and there's Saul Bellow, and there's Chekhov, and there's Hemingway, and because they're doing the whole century, and there's everyone that you can think of, and there's me. All the truly famous writers, and I think I have got to be the only person in here who's alive and really doesn't have an agent. And yes, I've had to do that with my work.
Now, you don't have an agent.
Well, I do right now.
Tell
But
us.
I mean, I've gone through most of my my career, my 30-year career, without an agent.
Now, why is that?
Because the agents are increasingly interested in the marketplace, and I think that when they deal with a person who is, putting their mind on the page and dealing with pure sensibility and consciousness, and is experimental and is a feminist and a revolutionary, that they just don't see any dollar signs there. And they have to be realists about it. And then the other side is that if you're just doing strictly literary work and you are not going to dinner parties with the editor of The New Yorker and Joan Didion, and you're not calling Joyce Carol Oates up to read her your newest great passage in a news story, and Gore Vidal is not phoning you or sending you a postcard from Rome, and I mean, if you don't know the powers that be, then there's really, what is an agent looking at? The work itself is not commercial. It's not, going to get published in places that will make money. And if you're not connected, if your parents, are not part of, I was just reading about Lucian Freud in The New Yorker and the grandson of Sigmund. If you don't come with a family pedigree, people are unlikely to feel that you really have much of a career ahead of you.
I'm looking at a copy of Lithium for Medea that I have. I think this copy was published in '89, and there's a wonderful quote on there by Joan Didion. And
she very rarely gives quotes.
Yeah, you never see her name.
And that was an accident. I just happened to know someone who was working with her on a project at that moment, and that's how that happened. But on the other hand, if Joan Didion had bothered to take any of my novels and review them and say, I would like to review Braverman's new novel or collection of stories in the New York Sunday Times, I would have a real career right now.
It's a bit disgusting that it's that way. I mean, are you accepting of it at this point, or are you disgusted by the whole deal, the way publishing is?
Well, it's so thoroughly broken my heart, gutted my life, and driven me insane to read stories that later go on to win awards and go into college textbooks and read them. Palm Latitudes, Time magazine, called me the voice of the region in '89 or something for that book. And it was rejected by over 100 publishers. And I received letters like, this may very well be a tour de force, but no one believes Mexican women can think like this, or who's interested in the barrio, or if you put a Spanish name on this, you would have a bestseller if you took your name off and gave it a Latina name. And, that did drive me insane when I would read passages of Palm Latitudes to myself and read the sorts of rejections I got. I lost my mind. And so what you see here is somebody who's inhabiting the remnants of a sensibility sort of posthumously. And, I've just, the commercial publishing apparatus has completely ruined my life.
Your name, speaking of names, your name, Braverman. Now, is that your name?
Uh-huh.
Because it's so symbolic, really. And you must have talked about this or thought about this before, but, brave, right?
Uh-huh.
You're probably one of the bravest, most honest writers that I can think of.
Well, that and $3.50 will get you a latte at Pete's, It just...
Have you always been like this? Have you always been so honest and outspoken?
Yes. That's part of the insurrection, whatever, of my work, that I just can't lie. And I love Rick Moody's introduction of the new Lithium for Medea. And one thing that struck me is he says twice in the introduction, this book never lies. And that he'd found it at a certain point, I guess, in his 20s, and what a light it was to him in the way that, revelatory acts of fiction are.
Yes.
And I wish I could lie.
Do you?
I have nothing morally against it. Really, I'd like to write soap operas for big bucks. But that's not what I do. That's not what my sensibility is about. That's not what my interior architecture is about. What I do is create, revolutionary works of art, like Frida. If you would have asked Frida Kahlo, for big money to make advertising billboards, she wouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing about being a real artist, is you can't sell out because you don't have the tools to do it.
Well, you're listening to Writers on Writing, and if you just tuned in, you're a little bit late, but we have a few minutes left with Kate Braverman, author of The Incantation of Frida K., published by Seven Stories Press. I notice with this book and with Lithium for Medea, for instance, that they're both in first person, and it seems that a lot of your work is. And I'm curious about that point of view, why you like it, why you choose it.
Many of the short stories are not in first person, and Palm Latitudes was not in first person. But basically, I do like first person. It seems more immediate to me, more modern, less of the conventions involved. And if you're just primarily concerned with experience and sensory data and consciousness, a first person is a logical choice. And also, I just naturally do it better. And it's like if you naturally ice skate, why ski? If you're a good ice skater, why learn another cold weather sport? And I think it's just easier for me, and it just seems more natural for me to write first person.
What about voice? What can you tell us about voice? Because it seems to be the one thing that characterizes a writer, or that makes a writer singular and recognizable, and possibly even, allows them to get their work out there.
I'm not sure I know what you mean by voice.
I mean, when you pick up a book, for instance, I could have a pile of books with nobody's, without authors' names. Pick up a book and know your writing. I would know your writing. I would know Raymond Carver's writing. I would know various authors' writing because of their voice. It's that stamp, that stamp that is you and no one else.
Right. That's probably why you can't get an agent and become like lethal. Your name becomes kryptonite. I think that my women who are heretics and women of solitary insurrections, women who carry in their designer purses concealed weapons, cash, and the grid for new identities, that is so thoroughly me. It is so thoroughly true that I don't construct a feminist personality. I am on a molecular level a feminist. That I am on I'm on a subatomic level a poet. And I have invented my own language. And I was just trying to find material to pad out this interview with, and all I found was like a couple of quotes, and this is from the Los Angeles Times, and it says, "What Braverman and Didion share is authority. Braverman is a visionary." And then they say my voice has become LA's most compelling. But I think that I have a great sense of authority in what I'm doing, and you could, raise your rifles at me and put a blindfold on me, and it wouldn't change a syllable of what I write. I inhabit the tropics, the derelict, brutal, tawdry blue under the fouled pastels. I know my places with a fierce intimacy. I know what it is to be at the millennium in a cutting-edge city at the end of a mean 1,000 years. I've truly inhabited my obsessions and my ambiguities. And in this I am fearless, and in this I am beyond innocent, beyond shakeable. I exist in a state of struggling against my enormous defects. My women, they struggle against enormous defects for transitory grace in acts of small heroism and tragedy. So, in short, they really think and breathe, and in short, they are real characters. And I think that, in the end, for anyone of discrimination, as Lorca might say, it is easy to put the fraud at length. In his great essay on art, Lorca talks about the difference between an artist and a fraud, and that it is immediately apparent. An artist writes with duende, up from the very soles of the feet, that it isn't a technique, but it's a matter of the heart and of passion, and that it cannot be taught. The fact that I am a mutation that sings could be, obvious.
I wish we had another hour, Kate.
Oh, Barbara, I just want to tell you one thing, and that without programs like yours with people who care enough, people like me would die even sooner in an even worse fashion.
Well, I appreciate that. I'd love to have you back.
Hey, I'm around.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Kate.
Bye.
That was Kate Braverman speaking to us from the Bay Area, author of The Incantation of Frida K., published by Seven Stories, author of Lithium for Medea, author of Palm Latitudes, many short stories. Check her work out. Oh, what can I tell you? I can tell you we're just about out of time, and if you want to know more, visit my website, writersonwriting.com. There's a conference here at UCI on October 5th. You can find out that info by going to asja.org, clicking on the right side of the screen where it says Take Your Writing to the Next Level, October 5th. I'm going to leave you with a quote by Virginia Woolf, who said, "As for my next book, I am going to hold myself from writing till I have it impending in me, grown heavy in my mind like a ripe pear, pendant, gravid, asking to be cut, or it will fall." You've been listening to Writers on Writing on 88.9 FM. I'm Barbara DeMarco-Barrett. Thank you for listening, and stay safe.